Hi, welcome to Property Insight. I'm Neil Harding.
I'm Mark Ashworth.
Today we're going to talk about some property investments that I've done, which are not the best property investments that I've ever done in my life. Not disastrous by any means, but also not investments that I think I would do today knowing what I now know.
So, an example of learning from your mistakes, right?
Yeah, learning from my mistakes. I think that's fair to say, and I think there's a phrase, isn't there, that you're either earning or learning. I think on these one or two, I was probably more learning than earning.
Well, I think without further ado, we ought to hear a little bit about them, Neil. So, should we just talk about one initially, maybe?
Yeah.
See what you think. See what we think.
Yeah. So the first one I've got in mind is a 3-bed terraced house, which I bought for £150,000. It was in average condition when I viewed the property. I was probably relatively inexperienced in viewing properties at the time. I had a decent idea what to look for when viewing a property. But one thing that I was not completely au fait with was let's say the energy efficiency of the property.
The EPC?
The EPC rating of it. This particular property had no central heating, so no gas radiator. It has electric storage heaters in the rooms, which is not always desirable for tenants. And so anyway, I bought this property. On paper, the deal stacked up and the yield looked fine. However, when I bought the property, it wasn't the easiest to let, so was empty for longer than I would have liked. So I didn't have to get to the point where I was dropping the rent before it got let, but I was starting to just sweat a little bit after a couple of weeks.
Did you do any work on the property? Or was it pretty much ready to let out?
It needed a little bit of a kiss and cuddle, not much. So I think I put in some new carpets and a painting and decorating, a little bit of a redeck. So maybe £2,000 spent on it, something like that. Not a huge amount.
I love the term kiss and a cuddle.
Bit of a kiss and a cuddle, yeah. So when I viewed the property, actually the property was marketed with an F.
On the EPC
rating, yeah.
Okay.
And the statutory requirement at the time was that all properties, if they were going to be let, had to be an E as a minimum, which so when I came to applying for a mortgage at the time, that failed. Didn't get a mortgage. Had to go back to the vendor. I didn't know all this at the time, so this was many years ago, and needed to get a new EPC. I basically had to say to the vendor via the estate agent, you need to get an EPC improvement and a rating of an E or above. They went away and did that, and lo and behold, within 2 or 3 weeks, got an EPC certificate on the property that had an E rating. So all good, I suppose for all intents and purposes at the time, it felt like a tick box exercise. And I don't think I really married up in my mind the lettability of the property with the actual practical sort of problems that you might get from living in a property that's not energy efficient, like not having central heating with gas radiators, which many tenants like to have. So since then, there's been some legislation that's been read and heard but not passed and by Parliament about EPC ratings, which you may have heard. We'll do separate content on this some other time, but essentially for the moment it's probably enough to say that there's a proposal out there that by 2028 all properties that are let need to have an EPC rating of a C or better. So to get this property from an E up to a C is going to cost me quite a bit of money.
Or might even be impossible.
It might be impossible. I certainly wasn't factoring that in when I bought the property, so a mistake made.
How long ago was it?
Yeah, I think this was probably 2018, 2019,
Okay.
something around there. And I commissioned a report actually from an EPC assessor, an independent assessor, to give me a report on what steps can I take to improve this property up to a C rating, and how much is it going to cost me to do it. So I got this report and it was bad news.
Oh dear.
This report basically said, well, first of all, thing to say is that it shouldn't have been an E, it's an F. Again, if I had really sort of paid more attention at the time, I probably would have thought, well, yeah, that makes sense. It was an F originally when the property was marketed for sale. So actually it's a case of what do I need to spend on the property to get it from an F up to a C. And well, it's going to be thousands of pounds. So I need to figure out at some point prior to 2028 what I'm going to do about that, with the main choices, of course, being either spend some money to improve it or perhaps sell the property.
So is it freehold, semi-detached, terraced? What is it?
Yeah, it's a freehold, 3-bed, terraced, probably Victorian house. Yeah, yeah.
Probably some of the... I mean, the thing is, you talk about EPCs and it being an issue. It's not to forget that there are streets and streets and streets of Victorian terraced properties all over the whole of the country. Probably a large percentage of which are being let to tenants. They are used in the private rented sector to house people. And the interesting thing is that you have to have this requirement to rent property out. However, you don't have to have this requirement if you own the house yourself. So quite what it's got to do with climate change, etc., I'm not quite sure, because there's a significant number of properties in the country that are owned by owner-occupiers that do not meet a C criteria. But yet the government doesn't seem to be wanting to do anything with those. Am I right? I think. Yes.
Well, yeah, completely.
But we're not going to turn this into a political video or argument. Yep. So let's just go with the facts. And so how is that property now? Is it rented? Is the tenant happy?
Yeah, the property's rented out at the moment. I get £850 a month in rental income. The tenant's been there for many years, and I think hoping to stay there for many years to come. So it's long-term tenancy. So, for all other intents and purposes, it's a decent buy-to-let property. Yeah. Tenants are happy. Perhaps they'll be happier with gas radiators and central heating. I don't know, but the house ultimately is warm and can be heated. I just need to figure out what I do with it in the future.
So I've got a couple of properties that have got electric heating, and in all fairness, I think that one of the biggest issues with heating a property these days is more to do with heat loss rather than heat generation. So it's about how quickly the heat escapes from the property as much as how it's actually created. So if it's created by electric radiators or gas radiators, it's largely irrelevant. It's how much of that heat is disappearing out of the cracks in the windows or under the, you know what I mean? Mm. And I'm not really sure whether the EPC assessment does assess that. He just kind of looks at the type of heating, puts it into a tick box exercise, and then spits out a result, which often isn't necessarily that detailed.
I think it can certainly sometimes seem like that, can't it? When you're a landlord on the receiving end of, sort of keeping your fingers crossed through the process and waiting to see, fingers and toes, everything crossed. Then you get to see what the EPC rating is, and it is what it is. And sometimes you think, well, if I got another EPC assessment next week, would it be the same or a different result? And sometimes you wonder.
It's just frustrating because it would be perfectly possible if the person owned it themselves, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But you mentioned about another one?
Yeah, so the other one that springs to mind is a leasehold flat. And I suppose I should also caveat this by saying, again, it's a fairly decent buy-to-let property, but again, not ideal and not one that I would do now. And that's really because when I purchased the property, the service charges were £1,250 per annum, which I think is fairly typical, fairly average for the investment area for me. And over the period of time that I've owned the property, which is now coming up to, I guess, 4 or 5 years, though the service charge has now increased, I was going to say steadily, but I don't think it has increased steadily actually. It's increased probably more dramatically to £1,900 per annum. So that's, sort of getting on for 50% increase across a 4 to 5 year period of time, I think that's a steep increase. And
So is that for covering like is it like because there's a lot of garden areas, or is it for keeping that maintained, or is it because there's a larger communal sort of staircases and corridors? Is that the reason, or?
well, yeah, it's a good question. The reasons are always quite difficult to pin down. I mean, the service charge does cover all those things. So there are communal areas, there are communal bins that need to be maintained, communal garden areas that need to be maintained. So there are genuine communal costs, lighting and etc., emergency lighting, and all these things need to be paid for. And we know that the cost of electricity has gone up a huge amount over the past few years, especially. Yeah, sure it has, but I think some of the costs can be avoided if, let's just say, if other tenants were better behaved sometimes in a block, that can sometimes end up costing the whole block some money. So wherever a tenant fly tips, for example, in a communal area, then the block service charge fee is going to increase because they have to pay to sort that out. But then there's other things which are probably not anyone's particular fault, such as if it's a gated entry block of flats, and it's quite often on a car park, the gated entries that can break, need to be repaired. That can be expensive. That can be thousands of pounds. All these things add up. So I think I find it really difficult to pin down on these accounts and invoices why exactly the cost has increased.
Oh, I think you're probably scrutinising those accounts, aren't you?
I'm looking at them. Yeah, I am looking at them, and sometimes you do sort of scratch your head when you're looking at it, thinking, "Gosh, that's increased by so much." Nevertheless, if I was looking at this right now, with those numbers, I wouldn't have bought the property. But you know what? It's gone up in value steadily over the years that I've had it. It's still giving me an income, just not as much as I would have liked, and not a deal that I would do right now.
Well, thanks so much for sharing, Neil. I think it's always useful to hear other people's stories, and also to hear stuff that's real and actually happening in the world of property, which obviously, hopefully, inspires you to either do some of the same, or maybe not some of the same. So we really do hope that that's been insightful and you've enjoyed this video, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you.